and a presentation of facts on both sides of the issue? See, the real problem here, one of the things we did a long time ago, is we separated the police power from the judicial power. This was an incredibly important first step. We also prevented the military from acting in our country because we didn't want to have a police state. One of the things that we greatly objected to with the British were that they were passing out what were called general writs, or writs of assistance. These were warrants that allowed them to go into a house, but allowed them to go into anyone's house. And so what we did when we wrote our Constitution is we made the Constitution, we made the Fourth Amendment specific to the person and the place and the things to be looked for. We didn't like the soldiers going willy-nilly into any house and looking for anything. So we made our Constitution much more specific. I think this is something we shouldn't give up on so easily. I think that the idea that we could deprive someone of their life without any kind of hearing, essentially allowing a politician. I'm not casting any aspersions on the president. I'm not saying he's a bad person at all, but he's not a judge. He's a politician. And he was elected by a majority, but the majority doesn't get to decide who we execute. We have a process for deciding this. We have courts for deciding this. To allow one man to accuse you in secret, you never get notified you've been accused. Your notification is the buzz of the propellers on the drone as it flies overhead in the seconds before you're killed. Is that what we really want from our government? Are we so afraid of terrorism? Are we so afraid of terrorists that we're willing to just throw out our rights and our freedoms, things that have been fought for and that we have gotten over the centuries? At least 800 years, if not 1,000 years worth of protection. Originally, the protections were against a monarch. We feared a monarch. We didn't like having a monarch. We came to this country, and so when we set up our presidency, there was a great deal of alarm. There was a great deal of fear over having a king. And so we limited the executive branch. Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, he said that the Constitution supposes what history demonstrates, that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war, most likely to go to war, and therefore we took that power to declare war and we vested it in the legislature. We broke up the powers. Montesquieu wrote about the checks and balances and the separation of powers, and he was somebody that Jefferson looked towards. They separated the powers because there's a chance for abuse of power when power resides in one person. Montesquieu said that there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the legislative. I would say something similar. There can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the judiciary. That's what we're doing here. We're allowing the president to be the accuser in secret, and we're allowing him to be the judge, and we're allowing him to be the jury. No man should have that power. We should fear that power. Not because we have to say, oh, we fear the current president. It has nothing to do with who the president is. It has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or Democrat. It has to do with whether or not you fear the consolidation of power. Whether you fear power being given to one person, whether a Republican or a Democrat. This is not necessarily a right-left issue. Kevin Gostola, who writes at Fire Dog Lake, writes, the mere fact that the president's answer to this question, whether you can kill an American on American soil, that the president's answer was yes, is outrageous. However, it fits the framework for fighting a permanent global war on terrorism without any geographic limitations, which the President Obama's administration, has maintained that it has the authority to wage. What's important here is that we're talking about a war without geographic limitations, but we're also talking about a war without temporal limitations. There is no limit in time to this war. When will this war end? It's a war that has, I think, an infinite timeline. So if you're going to suspend your rights if there's going to be no geographic limits to killing, which really means we're not at war in Afghanistan, we're at war everywhere, and everybody that pops up is called Al-Qaeda now, whether they've ever heard of Al-Qaeda or not, whether they have any communication with some kind of network of Al-Qaeda, everybody is Al-Qaeda. But there's a new war or an ongoing war everywhere in the world. There's no limitations. Glenn Greenwald has written also about this subject, and he was speaking at the Freedom to Connect conference, and he says there is a theoretical framework being built that posits that the U.S. government has unlimited power. Some call this inherent power. Inherent means it hasn't been defined anywhere. It hasn't been expressly given to the government. They've just decided this is their power. They're going to grab it and take what they can get. And this isn't new. The Bush administration did some of this too. When the Bush administration tried to grab power, though, on the left and some of us on the right were critical. When they tried to wiretap phones without a warrant, we raised a ruckus. Many on the right and many on the left. There was a loud outcry against President Bush for usurping, going across due process, not allowing due process, not obeying the restraints of warrants. Where is that outcry now? Glenn Greenwald writes, there's a theoretical framework being built that posits that the U.S. government has unlimited power. When it comes to any kind of threats it perceives, it makes the judgment to take whatever action against them that it warrants without any constraints or limitations of any kind. As Greenwald suggests, this is going back to Gastola's words, as Greenwald suggests, answering yes to the question that you can kill Americans on American soil illustrates the real radicalism that the government has embraced in terms of how it uses its own power. To think that we were opposed to them listening to your conversations without a warrant, but no one's going to stand up and say they can kill you without a warrant, a judge's review, or a jury, no one's going to object to that. Where's the cacophony that stood up and said, how can you tap my phone without going to a judge first? I ask, how can you kill someone without going to a judge or a jury? Are we going to give up our rights to politicians, to any politician of any stripe? Are we going to give up the right to decide who lives and who dies? Gastola goes on to say that the reason the administration didn't want to answer yes or no to this question of can you kill Americans on American soil, because he says that a no answer would jeopardize the critical theoretical foundation that they have very carefully constructed that says there are no cognizable constraints on how U.S. government power can be asserted. Civil libertarians once expected more from the president. In fact, it was one of the things that I liked about the president. I'm a Republican. I didn't vote or support the president either time. But I admired him, particularly in 2007 when he ran. I admired his ability to stand up and say, we won't torture people. That's not what America does. How does the president's mind work, though? The president that seems so honorable, seems so concerned with our rights, seems so concerned with the right not to have your phone be tapped, now says he's not concerned with whether you can be killed without a trial? The leap of logic is so fantastic as to boggle the mind. Where is the Barack Obama of 2007? Has the presidency so transformed him that he has forgotten his moorings, forgotten what he stood for? Civil libertarians once expected more from the president. Ask any civil libertarian whether or not the president should have the right to arbitrarily kill Americans on American soil, and the answer is easy. Of course, no president should have the right or that power under the Constitution. Now, Brennan has responded in committee that the CIA now does not have the right to do it on American soil. The problem is that this program is under the Department of Defense, so it's once again an evasive answer not answering the true question, will the government of America kill Americans on American soil? Gostola from Fire Dog Lake writes, there may never be a targeted killing of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, and the question of whether a U.S. citizen could be targeted and killed on U.S. soil may remain a hypothetical question for some time. But the fact that the Obama administration has told a U.S. senator that there is a circumstance where the government could target and kill an American citizen on American soil without charge and without trial is a stark example of an imperial presidency. This is what our founding fathers wanted to fight against. They wanted to limit the role and the power of the president. They wanted to check the president's power with the power of the Senate, with the power of the House, with the power of the judiciary. 3 co-equal branches. Not one of them should be able to run roughshod on the other. The problem has become is that we have allowed this to happen. Not me personally, but Congress in general has allowed the president to usurp this power. If there were an ounce of courage in this body, I would be joined by many other senators saying that they will not tolerate this, that we will come together today in bipartisan fashion and tell the president, tell any president, that no president will ever have the authority to kill Americans without a trial. Now, when the president says he doesn't intend to do so, you really have to think that through. The president a year ago signed a law that says that you can be detained indefinitely, that you can be sent from America to Guantanamo Bay without a trial. And he wants us to be comforted. He wants us to remember and think good of him because he says, I don't intend to do so. Well, it's not enough. I mean, would you tolerate a Republican who stood up and said, well, I like the First Amendment. I'm quite fond of the First Amendment. And I don't intend to break the First Amendment, but I might. Would conservatives tolerate someone who said, I like the Second Amendment? I think it's important and I'm for gun ownership and I don't intend to violate the Second Amendment, but I might. Would we tolerate that he doesn't intend to do so as a standard? We have to think about the standards being used overseas. The president finally admitted, they interviewed him at Google not too long ago. They interviewed him and they asked him, can you kill Americans at home? And he was evasive, but he said if there are rules, he said the rules will be different outside than inside. Well, I certainly hope so. Outside the United States, the rules for killing are you can kill someone through a signature strike. We don't have to know what your name is, who you are, who you're with. If you're in a line of traffic and we think you're going from talking to bad people to talking to other bad people, we'll kill you. I mean, is that going to be the standard in America? Now, when they're questioned about, have you killed civilians in your drone strikes? They say no. But they don't count you as a civilian if you're a male or if you're between the ages of 16 and 50. You're a potential and a probable combatant if that's your age range. So my question is, if you're not a civilian, if you're in proximity to bad people, is that the standard we're going to use in the United States? So if we're going to kill Americans on American soil, and the standard's going to be signature strikes, that you're close to bad people, or that you're in the same proximity as bad people, would that be enough? Are we happy with that standard? Are we happy there'll be no jury, no trial, no charges, nothing done publicly? In Eric Holder's response, the Attorney General's response to me, they maintain they're not going to do this, just trust them. It's not really about them, though. It is about the law. The law restrains everyone equally, regardless of your party, whether you're Republican or Democrat. The law is out there for the time when somebody inadvertently elects a really bad person. You know, when World War II ended, the currency was being destroyed in Germany. 1923, the paper money became so worthless that people wheeled it in wheelbarrows. They burned it for fuel. It became virtually worthless overnight. The beginning of September 1923, the paper, I think it was like 10, 15 marks for a loaf of bread. September 14th, it was 1,000 marks. September 30th, it was 100,000 marks. October 15th, it was a couple of million marks for a loaf of bread. It was a chaotic situation. Out of that chaos, Hitler was elected democratically. They elected him out of this chaos. The point isn't that anybody in our country is Hitler. I'm not accusing anybody of being that evil. I think it's an overplayed and a misused analogy. But what I am saying is that in a democracy, you could someday elect someone who is very evil. That's why we don't give the power to the government. And it's not an accusation of this president or anybody in this body. It's a point to be made historically that occasionally even a democracy gets it wrong. So when a democracy gets it wrong, you want the law to be there in place. You want this rule of law. As I mentioned, Hayek said that this is what distinguishes us. Nothing distinguishes us more clearly from arbitrary government and a government of whims and a rule of law, and a stable and consistent government as the rule of law. Heritage has an author who's written some about the oath of office. His name's Kasavin, and he writes that the location and the phrasing of the oath of office for the president, and this is something I mentioned earlier, that the president says he will protect and defend and preserve the Constitution. The oath is, words are important. The oath doesn't say I intend to preserve, protect, and defend. It says I will. Kasavin writes, though, that the location and phrasing of the oath of office strongly suggests that it's not empowering but limiting. So the president doesn't take an oath of office that says, I intend to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but I also feel that I have inherent powers that were never mentioned by anybody, that I will be the sole arbiter of interpreting what those powers are. That sounds more like a king. That's not what we wanted. We did not want an imperial presidency. What Kasavin suggests is that the oath of office is not empowering, but that it is limiting, that the clause limits the president and how the president can execute or how the executive power can be exercised. One unanswered word in that Constitution includes the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. What does the Fifth Amendment say? The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury. It's pretty explicit. The Fifth Amendment protects you. It protects you from a king placing you in the tower, but it also should protect you from a president that might kill you with a drone. We were granted due process. It's not always easy to sort out the details of who is a threat to the country and who's not a threat to the country. If it were people with grenade launchers on their shoulders, that's easy. And in fact, I agree completely. You don't get due process if you're actively attacking America. But you have to realize that there have been reports that over half of the drone strikes overseas are not even directed towards an individual. They're directed towards a caravan of unnamed individuals. You also have to realize that overseas, I have no problems. If people are shooting at American soldiers, by all means, they get no due process. But you also have to realize that many, we don't know because they won't tell us the number, but many of the drone strikes overseas are done when you're walking, I don't know where you're walking, to church, you're walking to a restaurant, you're walking along the road. They're done when you're in a car driving. They're done when you're in a house eating. They're done when you're in a restaurant eating. They're done when you're in a home sleeping. And I'm not even saying all those people don't deserve what they got. But I am saying that they're not actively involved in something that's an imminent threat. And if they were in America, they would be arrested. If we think you're a terrorist in America, we should arrest you. But here's the question, who is a terrorist? That's why I've been so concerned with a lot around here that want to say if you're associated with terrorism. The reason is that your government has already put out things that I think are of questionable nature. The Bureau of Justice put out a bulletin within the last year describing people who you need to be worried about. These are the people that you're supposed to say something. If you see something, you're supposed to say something. Who are these terrorists that live among you? People who might be missing fingers on one hand, people who might have stains on their clothing, people who might have changed the color of their hair, people who like to pay in cash, people who own more than one gun, people who own weatherized ammunition, people who have 7 days of food in their house. These are people that you should be afraid of and that you should report to your government. So says your government. Are they going to be on the drone strike list? I think we need to get an answer from the president. If you're going to kill people in America, we need rules, and we want to know what your rules are. Because I certainly don't want to have 7 days of food in my house if that's on the list for terrorism. Interestingly, on government websites, there are some government websites that advise you to have food in your house. If you live in a hurricane-prone area, you're supposed to keep some extra food around. Who's going to decide when it's okay to have food in your house and when it's not? There's something called fusion centers. Fusion centers are something that are supposed to coordinate between the federal government and the local government to find terrorists. The one in Missouri a couple years ago came up with a list, and they sent this to every policeman in Missouri. This kind of concerns me. The people on the list might be me. People on the list from the Fusion Center in Missouri that you need to be worried about, that policemen should stop, are people who have bumper stickers that might be pro-life, who have bumper stickers that might be for more border security, people who support third-party candidates, people who might be in the Constitution Party. Ooh, isn't there some irony there? You might be in the Constitution Party. You believe in the Constitution so much, you might be a terrorist. So I think we need to be concerned about this. Things are not so black and white. If someone's shooting a gun at us, a cannon, a missile, a rocket, a plane, it's pretty easy to know what lethal attacks are and to repel them, and that there should be no due process. But we're talking about people in their home. We're talking about people at a restaurant or a cafe that someone is making an accusation. If the accusation is based on how many fingers you have on your hand, I've got a problem with that standard. If the standard to be used for killing Americans is whether you pay in cash, I've got a problem with that. If the standard to be used in America is being close to someone who is bad or the government thinks is bad is enough for you to be killed, and not even to count you as an accidental kill, to count you as a combatant because you were near them. See, here's the problem, and this is no passing problem. This is an important problem. There was a man named Al-Awlaki. He was a bad guy. By all evidence available to the public that I've read, he was treasonous. I have no sympathy for his death. I still would have tried him in a federal court for treason, and I think he could have been executed. But his son was 16 years old, had missed his dad, gone for 2 years. His son sneaks out of the house and goes to Yemen. His son is then killed by a drone strike. Now, they won't tell us if he was targeted. I suspect, since there were other people in the group, there's about 20 people killed, that they were targeting someone else. I don't know that. I don't have inside information on that, but I suspect that. But here's the real problem. When the president's spokesman was asked about Al-Awlaki's son, do you know what his response was? This I find particularly callous and particularly troubling. The president's response to the killing of Al-Awlaki's son, he said he should have chosen a more responsible father. Well, you know, it's kind of hard to choose who your parents are. That's sort of like saying to someone whose father is a thief or a murderer or rapist, which is obviously a bad thing, but does that mean it's okay to kill their children? Think of the standard we would have. If our standard for killing people overseas is you should have chose a more responsible parent, It just boggles the mind and really affects me to think about that would be our standard. There's absolutely no excuse for the president not to come forward on this. I've been asking for a month for an answer. It's like pulling teeth to get any answer from the president. Why is that? Because he doesn't want to answer the question the way he should as a good and moral and upstanding and someone who believes in the Constitution should, that absolutely no American should ever be killed in America who's sitting in a cafe. No American should ever be killed in their house without a warrant and some kind of aggressive behavior by them, to be bombed in your sleep. There's nothing American about that. There's nothing constitutional about that. But he says trust him. He says he hasn't done it yet. He says he doesn't intend to do so, but he might. Mr. President, that's just not good enough. That's not enough. It's not enough for me to be placated. It's not enough for me to be quiet. So I've come here today to speak for as long as I can. I won't be able to speak forever, but I'm going to speak as long as I can to draw attention to something that I find really to be very disturbing. People have asked about this nomination process because I've actually voted for a couple of the president's nominees, some of whom I've objected to, some of whom I've had personal differences as well as political differences. This is not about partisanship. I voted for the Secretary of State, John Kerry. I have almost nothing in common with him politically. I've disagreed with him repeatedly on the floor, but I gave the president the prerogative of choosing his Secretary of State because I think the president won the election. He deserves to get to make some choices on who's in his cabinet. I voted for the very controversial Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel. There were things I liked about him, things I disliked about him. I filibustered him twice before I voted to let him go forward. And people have given me a hard time. Conservatives from my party have blasted me for doing that. But I gave the president that prerogative. So I'm not standing down here as a Republican who will never vote for a Democrat. I voted for the first two. I voted for the first three nominees by the president. This is not about partisanship. I have allowed the president to pick his political appointees, but I will not sit quietly and let him shred the Constitution. I cannot sit at my desk quietly and let the president say that he will kill Americans on American soil who are not actively attacking a country. I mean, the answer should be so easy. I can't imagine that he will not expressly come forward and say, no, I will not kill Americans on American soil. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be held for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on the presentment or indictment of a grand jury. It goes on to say that no person will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Now, some hear due process, and if you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, when you first hear it, you think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to have due process? What it means is you're protected. You get protections. Is our justice system perfect? No, sometimes you go all the way through due process in our country, and we've actually convicted people who are innocent. Fortunately, it's very rare, but think about that. We've actually convicted people who are innocent. What are the chances that the president, going through a PowerPoint slideshow and flashcards, might make a mistake on innocent or guilt? I would say there is a chance. Even our judicial system that goes through all of these processes, with judge reviewing the indictment, with a jury reviewing it, and then with a sentencing phase, with all of that going forward, we sometimes make mistakes. What are the chances that one man, one politician, no matter what party they're from, could make a mistake on this? I think there's a real chance that that exists. That's why we put these rules in place. Patrick Henry wrote that the Constitution wasn't given or written or put down to restrain you. The Constitution was to restrain us. There's always been, since the beginning of time, since we first had government, this desire to restrain the government, to try to keep the government from going too strong, to try to keep the government from taking your rights. It's interesting when you look at the Constitution gave what are called enumerated powers to government. And Madison said that these enumerated powers were few and defined. The liberties you were given, though, are numerous and unlimited. So there's about 17 powers given to government, which we've now transformed into about a gazillion, or at least a million new powers. We don't pay much attention to the enumerated powers or to the Constitution anymore. But the Constitution left your rights. They left your rights as unenumerated. They aren't limited. Your rights are limitless. So when we get to the 9th and 10th Amendment, it says specifically that those rights not granted to your government are left to the states and the people respectively. It didn't list what those rights are. The 14th Amendment talks about privileges and immunities are left to you also. They're to be protected. But I don't think there's a person in America. That's why I can't understand the president's unwillingness to say he's not going to kill non-combatants. Think about that. He's unwilling to say publicly that he's not going to kill non-combatants. Because that's what we're talking about here. I'm not talking about someone with a bazooka or a grenade launcher on their shoulder. Anyone committing lethal force can be repelled with lethal force. No one argues that point. I'm talking about whether you can kill non-combatants. Because many of the people being killed overseas are non-combatants. Are they potential combatants? Maybe. Will the maybe the standard can be a less overseas than it is here for people involved in a battle, but it's getting kind of murky overseas as well. But for goodness sakes, in America, we can't just sort of have this idea that we're going to kill non-combatants. We're talking about people eating in a cafe, at home, in a restaurant. I think we need to be a little more careful. The power that was given by the Constitution to the Senate was that of advise and consent. This constitutional provision provides us with the power to consent to nominations or withhold consent. It's a check on the executive branch, but it only works if we actually use it. I'm here today to speak for as long as I can hold up to try to rally support from people from both sides to say, for goodness sakes, why don't we use some advice and consent? Why don't we advise the president that he should come forward and say he will not condone, nor does he believe he has the authority to kill non-combatants? As a check on the executive branch, this power that's granted to the Senate is the right to withhold consent. The Constitution doesn't provide senators with the specifics or the criteria of why we withhold consent. That's left to us to decide. I withhold my consent today because I'm deeply concerned that the executive branch has not provided an answer, that the president refuses to say that he won't kill non-combatants. The president swore an oath to the Constitution. He said he will protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution. He didn't say, I intend to when it's convenient. He said, I will defend the Constitution. And it's inexcusable for him not to come forward. There's an author that writes for The Atlantic who's written a lot about the drone program by the name of Connor Friedersdorf. He recounts the tale of Al-Awlaki's son who was killed, and he said when the president's spokesman was asked about the strike that killed him, the president's spokesman replied, well, he'd have been fine if he'd had a more responsible father. If that's our standard, we've sunk to a real low. Cornered by reporters after this, White House Secretary Robert Gibbs attempted to defend the kill list, which is secret, of course. You have to remember, if we're going to kill non-combatants in America, or people we think might someday be combatants, the list will be secret. So you won't get a chance to protest, hey, I'm not that bad. I might have said that one time, but I'm not that bad. All right? I have objected to big government, not all government. I'm not fomenting revolution. I was critical at that meeting. I was at a Tea Party meeting and I was critical of the president. But I'm not a revolutionary. Please don't kill me. Should we live in a country where you have to be worried about what you say? Should we live in a country where you have to worry about what you write? What kind of country would that be? Why is there not more moral outrage? Why is there not every senator coming down to say, you're exactly right, let's go ahead and hold this nomination, and why don't we hold it till we get more clarification from the president? Connor Friedersdorf of The Atlantic writes that it's vital for the uninitiated to understand how Team Obama misleads when it talks about the drone program. Ask how their kill list can be justified. Gibbs, the president's spokesman, replies, when there are people who are trying to harm us and have pledged to bring terror to these shores, we have taken the fight to them. But since the kill list itself is secret, there's no way to offer a specific counterexample. It's one thing to say, yeah, these people are going to probably come and attack us, which, to tell you the truth, is probably not always true. There are people fighting a civil war in Yemen who probably have no conception of ever coming to America. Friedersdorf goes on to say, but we do know that U.S. drones are targeting people who've never pledged to carry out attacks in the United States. So we're talking about non-combatants who have never pledged to carry out attacks or being attacked overseas. Think about it, if that's going to be the standard at home, people who have never really truly been involved with combat against us. Take Pakistan, where the CIA kills some people without even knowing their identities. This is more from Friedersdorf. As Obama nears the end of his term, officials said the kill list in Pakistan has slipped to fewer than 10 al-Qaeda targets, down from as many as 24. And yet we're killing hundreds of people in Pakistan. There's a quote that I think sort of brings this and makes this very poignant. There's a quote from an ex-CIA agent, I think it's Bruce Radel, who says, the drone strike program is sort of like a lawnmower. You can keep mowing them down, but as soon as the lawnmower stops, the grass grows again. Some people have gone one step further and said, for every one you kill, or for every one you accidentally kill that you didn't intend to kill, 10 more spring up. Think about it. If it were your family member and they've been killed and they were innocent, or you believe them to be innocent, it's going to make you more or less likely to become involved with attacking the United States. I've written a couple letters to John Brennan, who's been put up for the CIA nomination. I think it looks like the first letter was sent January 25th. So here we are into March, and I only got a response when he was threatened. So here's a guy who the president promotes as being transparent and wanting to give a lot of information to the American people. He won't respond to a U.S. senator. How do they treat the U.S. Senate with disdain, basically? Won't even respond to us, much less the American people, when I asked him these questions. He finally responded only when his nomination was threatened. So when it came to the committee and it appeared as if I had bipartisan support for slowing down his nomination if he didn't answer his questions, then he answered his questions. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence that in the future, going forward, if he is approved, that he's going to be real forthcoming and real transparent about this. I don't have a lot of anticipation or belief that we're going to get more information after this nomination hearing. Some are now saying, you know, you've gotten your pound of flesh, let him go, and we'll keep working on this. The problem is once he's gone, the discussion's over. Others in my party have been trying to get information about what went horribly wrong in Benghazi and have gotten some of that information, but only by using it as leverage to try to get the president to do what is the honorable thing, and that is to be more transparent with his ways. In the first letter that I sent to Brennan, I asked him the question, is it legal to order the killing of American citizens and that you would not be compelled to even give your reasoning, not even specific to the case, but any of your reasoning? So finally, as these questions came forward, some of the things were leaked out. One of the most troubling things that came out is when Brennan and the president finally began to talk about the drone strike program, which according to the former press secretary, they were to deny that it existed for years. When they finally came out, they told us a couple of things about their interpretation of it. One, that they have no geographic limit to their drone strikes. The second thing is they told us what they thought was imminent. And this is pretty important because a lot of Americans, myself included, believe that if we're being attacked, you can respond with lethal force. But a lot of Americans think that you have to actually be engaged in that to respond with lethal force. But they told us that the way their lawyers interpret imminent is imminent doesn't have to mean immediate. Well, only a bunch of lawyers could get together, government lawyers get together and say that imminent is not immediate. And you have to understand, and what we should be asking the president is this your standard for America? If you are going to assert that you have the right to kill Americans on American soil, are you going to assert that your standard is that an imminent threat doesn't have to be immediate? I'm quite concerned when I hear this kind of evasiveness, this sort of non-response to questions. We also asked, would it not be appropriate to require a judge or a court to review this? See, here's the real interesting thing. We had a president who ran for office saying your phone shouldn't be tapped without a warrant. I happen to agree with the candidate Obama. But what happened to candidate Obama who wanted to protect your right to privacy of your phone, who doesn't care much about your right not to be killed by a drone without any kind of judicial proceeding? I think we should demand it. The way things work around here, though, is people kind of say, yes, we'll demand it, and maybe later on this year we'll talk about a bill or talk about getting something. What they should do is just say no more. We're not going to move forward until we get some justice. We're not going to let the president, any president, Republican or Democrat, do this. One of the other questions I asked the president was, it is paradoxical that the federal government would need to go before a judge to authorize a wiretap on U.S. citizens, even overseas, but possibly not have any kind of oversight of killing an American here in America. We've asked him how many citizens have been killed. We haven't gotten an answer to that. They say not many, and hopefully it hasn't been many. But I think it's important to know. I think it would be important to know if we're going to target Americans in America, if that list exists. I think it would be important to know if being close to someone is also justified. You know, just because what if you just happen to live in the neighborhood of somebody who's a suspected terrorist? Is it okay because you were close to them? What if you happen to go to dinner with a guy you didn't know or a woman you didn't know and the government says they're a terrorist? Just because you're having dinner with them and you're of a male between the ages of 16 and 50, does that make you a combatant? We also asked the question, do you condone the CIA's practice of counting civilians killed by U.S. drone strikes as militants simply because they were of the same age? Like every other question, no answer. We asked him whether al-Awlaki's son was a target. No answer. We asked how many people have been targeted. No answer. Part of the problem with this is that or Congress in general, is sloppy about writing legislation in general. I'll give you an example. When Obamacare legislation was written, it's over 2,000 pages, but it leaves up to the Secretary of Health, I think 1,800 times the power to decide at a later date what the law or the rule would be. So since Obamacare of 2,000 pages has been written, there have been now 9,000 pages of regulations. Dodd-Frank's kind of the same way. Dodd-Frank was a couple thousand pages. It's now going to wind up with 8,000 or 9,000 pages of regulations. We abdicate our responsibility by not really writing legislation. We write shells of legislation that are imprecise and don't retain the power. And because of that, the executive branch and the bureaucracy, which is essentially the same thing, do whatever they want. This happened also with the use of authorization of force in Afghanistan. This happened, over 10 years ago now, 12 years ago. I thought we were going to war against the people who attacked us, and I'm all for that. I would have voted for the war. I would have preferred it to have been a declaration of war. I think we were united in saying, let's get those people who attacked us on 9/11 and make sure it never happens again. The problem is as this war has drug on, they take that authorization of use of force to mean pretty much anything. And so they have now said that the war has no geographic limitations, so it's really not a war in Afghanistan. It's a war in Yemen, Somalia, Mali. It's a war in unlimited places. Were we a body that cared about our prerogative to declare war, we would take that power back. But I'll tell you how poor, and this is on both sides of the aisle, how poor is our understanding or belief in retaining that power here. About a year ago, I tried to end the Iraq War. You may say, well, I thought the Iraq War was already over. It is, but we still have an authorization of use of force that says we can go to war in Iraq anytime. And since they think the use of force in Afghanistan means limitless war anywhere, anytime in the whole world, for goodness sakes, wouldn't we try to take back a declaration of war and authorization of force if the war is over? But here's the sad part. I actually got a vote on it, and I think I got less than 20 votes. You can't end a war after it's over up here. And it has repercussions because these authorizations to use force are used for many other things. So the authorization of force says you can go after al-Qaeda or associated terrorists. The problem is that when you allow the executive branch to sort of determine what is al-Qaeda, you've got no idea. For the most part, I will not be able to determine that either. All the information is classified, and there are a lot of bad people. There's a war going on in Yemen, and I don't know how much it has to do with us, or how much that there's an al-Qaeda presence there trying to organize to come and attack us. Maybe there is, but maybe there's also people who are just fighting their local government. How about Mali? I'm not sure that in Mali they're probably worried more about trying to get the next day's food than coming over here to attack us. But we have to ask these questions, and we have to ask about limitations on force, because essentially what we have now is a war without geographic boundaries. And we have many on my side who come down here and they say, oh, the battlefield's here in America. Be worried. Be alarmed. Alarm bells should go off when people tell you that the battlefield's in America. Why? Because when the battlefield's in America, we don't have due process. What they're talking about is they want the laws of war. Another way of putting that, they call it the laws of war. Another way to put it is called it martial law. That's what they want in the United States when they say the battlefield is here. One of them, in fact, said, if they ask for a lawyer, you tell them to shut up. Well, if that's the standard we're going to have in America, I'm quite concerned that the battlefield would be here and that the Constitution wouldn't apply. Because to tell you the truth, if you are shooting at us in Afghanistan, the Constitution doesn't apply over there. But I certainly want it to apply here. If you're engaged in combat overseas, you don't get due process. But when people say, oh, the battlefields come to America and the battlefields everywhere, the war is limitless in time and scope, be worried. Because your rights will not exist if you call America a battlefield for all time. We've asked him whether the strikes are exclusively focused on al-Qaeda and what is the definition of being part of al-Qaeda. In 1947, the National Security Act was passed, and it said the CIA doesn't operate in America. Most lay people know that. The CIA is supposed to be doing surveillance and otherwise outside the U.S. of foreign threats. The FBI works within the United States. They do some of the same thing, but they're different groups. CIA operating in Iraq or Afghanistan doesn't get a warrant before they do whatever they do to snoop on our enemies. The FBI in our country does. They operate under different rules and for a reason. So we don't want them to operate in the United States. It's not we're saying the CIA are bad people. We just don't want them operating with no rules or with the rules that we allow them to operate overseas. We don't want them operating in our country. The disappointing thing is that a month ago when I asked John Brennan this question, as his nomination came forward, and said I couldn't get an answer. He would not answer the question about the CIA operating in the United States. Only after yanking his chain, browbeating him in committee, threatening not to let him out of committee, does he finally say he's going to obey the law. We should be alarmed by that. Alarm bells should go off when we find that what is going on here is it takes that much for him to say that he's going to obey the law. Now, the president has said, don't worry, because he's not going to kill you with a drone unless it's infeasible to catch you. Now, sounds kind of comforting, but I guess if our standard for whether we kill you or not is whether it's practical or not, that does bother me a little bit. It just doesn't sound quite strict enough, because I'm kind of worried that, maybe there's a sequester and the president says we can't have tours of the White House. Maybe he's not got enough people to go arrest you. He had policemen behind him. He said he was going to lay off the policemen. Of course, he doesn't have anything to do with the policemen, so don't worry about that. But he had the policemen behind him. He's going to lay off. So maybe it's infeasible because he's laid off the policemen, so it's going to be easier to kill you. So, I know that sounds like we've gone a slippery slope beyond what he's asking for. But if the standard is it's infeasible to capture you, and that's what you're hanging your hat on, I'd be a little concerned that may not be enough protection for Americans on American soil. Now, there is a law called Posse Comitatus. It's been on the books since shortly after the Civil War. And it's once again one of these things a lot of people don't think about, but it's an important thing. It says the military doesn't operate on U.S. soil unless there's a declaration of an insurrection or civil war. There has to be a process that Congress goes through. And we've had this law for a long time. And once again, the reason we do it is not because we think our military are bad people. I'm proud of our soldiers. I'm proud of our Army. I'm proud of what they do for our country. But they operate under different rules. And it's a much more dangerous environment they operate under, and it's different. It's still dangerous in America, but policemen have a different rules of engagement than your soldiers have. And there's more restrictions and restraint on what we do in our country. So that's why we say the military can't operate here. So when we ask the president, can you kill Americans on American soil with your drone strikes, which is part of the military, it should be an easy answer. In fact, I hope someone's calling him now and asking him for an answer. It saved me a lot of time and breath, and my throat's already dry, and I just got started. But if they would ask him for an answer, can the military operate in the United States? Well, no. The law says the military can't operate in the United States. It's on the books, and he should simply do the honorable thing and say he will obey the law. It's simple. But I don't get why they refuse to answer it. It worries me that they refuse to answer the question, because by refusing to answer it, I believe that they believe they have expansive power, unlimited power. The real irony of this is that many on the left, Senator Barack Obama included, were very critical of the Bush administration. They felt like the Bush administration usurped power. They felt like the Bush administration argued invalid aggrandizement or grasping for power. John Yoo was one of the architects of this, believing in basically if the president just says, hey, I'm going to protect you, I can do whatever the hell I want. Many on the left objected to that. Some of us on the right also objected to this usurpation of power by the Republican president. But the thing is now the shoe's on the other foot, and we're not seeing any of that. We're all of a sudden now seeing a president who was worried about wiretaps, not at all worried about the legality of killing Americans on American soil with no judicial process. But the law Posse Comitatus prevents this from happening. It's very clear. It's been on the books 150 some odd years. I would think it would be pretty easy for the president to go ahead and say he will obey the law. We asked Brennan the question on this, and we got no answer. The answers that we've gotten are almost more disturbing than getting an answer, really, to tell you the truth. Because when the president responds that I haven't killed any Americans yet at home, and that I don't intend to do so, but I might, it's incredibly alarming and really goes against his oath of office. He says in his oath of office that I will preserve, I will protect, and I will defend the Constitution. It doesn't say I intend to or that I might. Can you imagine the furor if people were talking about the Second Amendment? Can you imagine what conservatives would say if a president said, well, yeah, I kind of like the Second Amendment, and I intend to, when convenient, when it's feasible, to protect the Second Amendment? Or what about those who believe in the First Amendment? If the president were to say, I haven't broken the First Amendment yet, I intend to follow it, but I might break it. Or I intend to follow it when it's feasible. So I have all these rules, and that's what the president answered. When he was at Google campus a couple of weeks ago, they asked him the question, can you kill Americans on American soil? And he said, well, the rules will probably be different outside the U.S. than inside. Which basically means, yes, he thinks he can kill Americans on American soil, but he's going to have some rules. Don't worry about it, because he will make some rules and there will be a process, but it won't be due process. It'll be a process that he sets up in secret in the White House, and I don't find that acceptable. The only answer really acceptable, we ask a question that could be yes or no. Can you kill an American on American soil? It's a yes or no question. They've been very evasive, and they have never really answered the question. But when we ask it, we pretty much knew only one answer was acceptable, and that answer is no. I mean, and if you don't answer it, basically, by not answering it, you're saying yes. I was actually a little bit startled when I finally got the answer, yes, we can kill Americans on American soil. I thought for sure that they would just be evasive to the end and try to get their nominee through without opening Pandora's box. But they have opened Pandora's box, and it would be a mistake for us to ignore it. It would be a mistake for us to ignore the ramifications of what they've done. When we separate out police power from judicial power, it's an important separation. The police can arrest you. They're allowed to do certain things. But the policeman that comes to your door and puts handcuffs on you doesn't decide your guilt. Now, sometimes we don't always think about how important this separation is. But it's incredibly important that those who arrest you they're not even really the ones who ultimately accuse you. The court, through the people, accuse you, and then you're given a trial to determine your guilt. And it's complicated. It isn't always clear who's innocent and who's guilty. Judges and juries make mistakes, but at least we have a process. You get appeals most of the time. So we have a significant process going on that has several hundred-year tradition at the least. So what really gets me about the process that the president favors is it's the trust me process. I have no intention of doing bad things. I will do good things. I'm a good person. And I'm not really disputing his motives or not saying he isn't a good person, but I'm disputing someone who's naive enough to think that that's good enough for our republic, that his good intentions are good enough for our republic. It never would have been accepted. It would have been laughed out of the Constitutional Convention. The Founding Fathers would have objected so strenuously that that person probably would never have been elected to office in our country. Someone who doesn't believe that the rules have to be in place and that we can't have our rights guaranteed by the intentions of our politicians. Think about it. Congress has about a 10% approval rating. Think the American people want to base whether they're going to be killed by a drone on a politician? I certainly don't. Doesn't have anything to do with whether he's a Republican or a Democrat. I would be here today if this were a Republican president, because you can't give that much power to one person. We separated the police power from the adjudication or from the jury power, from the decisions on innocence and guilt, is separate from the police power, purposefully so and with great forethought. Some transform this, and the president's tried, Brennan has tried to transform this into, oh, well, we need to reserve this power for when planes are attacking the Twin Towers. Well, that's not what we're talking about, Mr. President, and I think you misunderstand, or you purposely misunderstand, or you purposely obfuscate, or you purposely mislead. No one is questioning whether the U.S. can repel an attack. No one is questioning whether your local police can repel an attack. Anybody involved in lethal force, the legal doctrine in our country, and